can begin with a few laughs. Yes, it was 1 year ago when I first connected with you. I began by telling you that launching my podcast, The Inner Circle with Carrie was a dream realized. Well, 1 year later, I can still say the same thing. But I can also tell you so much more now. For me, this past year, it has been a year like no other. It's been a year of change. It's brought awakenings, many sleepless nights, countless frustrations, stress, self-doubt, a lot of growth, and a massive discovery about my why, which I'll share with you a little later on in the podcast. Oh, and by the way, hi everybody, it's me, Carrie Doll. Thank you so much for holding space for me and your busy life today. I can't believe it's been a year since I sat solo in front of this podcast mic. Thought it was time to reconnect. A lot of you have been asking, how are things going? What has this journey been like? Honestly, it's been a bit of a blur. So much has happened in my crazy entrepreneurial journey, including the launch of this podcast, along with my business that focuses on storytelling and public speaking coaching. I'm going to begin here. It has been so unbelievably hard, harder than I ever could have imagined. You know what? There's a reason that entrepreneurs say when it's easy, it's hard, and when it's hard, it's really freaking hard. And it's not just one thing, it's everything. I mean, I finally understand what entrepreneurs mean when they say this. You are ready to launch your business when you are 60% there, because that's exactly where I was at. But do you have any idea how scary 60% is for a person like me who always wants things to be at 110% before they do everything? And I mean everything. I am the most linear thinker you will ever meet. But in this last year, I've learned that 60% is everything in so many ways. You know, you have to start somewhere, and often there is nothing linear about the process. Sometimes it's impossible to anticipate everything until you're knee deep in all the shit. For example, when I launched my online course, I had 10 modules written, recorded, worksheets designed and formatted, uploaded to my website, only to discover a mere 2 weeks before my launch that my entire website had to be rebuilt through a host website to enable the sale of my courses. I mean, who knew? Clearly, I didn't. I found that out when I ventured beyond the 60%. Was there panic? Absolutely. I mean, how can there not be? And do you know how that panic manifested itself in me? I wanted to quit. Like every single day. Even though I loved what I was doing, I wanted to quit. I was so afraid of failure, and most days I was so underwater, I was paralyzed by the workload. And then you add to that I had saved a lot of money for this project and the launch, and that money was leaking through what I thought was a sinking ship, and there I was, desperately trying to plug holes. And do you know what one of the hardest parts of this journey is and continues to be? This whole social media game. And I call it a game because that is how it feels. I mean, honestly, there are some days I would like to use my phone as a football and boot it out of my life because it is such an energy vampire. Because there's all this pressure to try and post almost every single day. Now, I get it. The flip side of this is my Instagram followers are kind of like family to me. They support me and they support my business, and I want to connect with them and all of you and lift you up and support you back. I get that part. I will say I have had a lot of guidance and help in this area, and I'm now using platforms that allow me to schedule my posts in advance so I can be present in the moment. So it's getting better. I'm navigating the storm. But before I leave the topic of social media, I need to say this. It's creating such a false and dangerous standard because it's filled with perfect pictures that reflect perfect lives that use like 10 filters on them. And no one's life is like that. Behind closed doors, we're all going through a lot. And it's leading to a ridiculous amount of anxiety for so many people. I've honestly gone the other way on social media on purpose. I post without makeup. I post in the moment. The other day, I called two of my favorite women by the same name during this long video post, and I only discovered it after the fact, but I wanted to ensure that the event got massive love. So, well, it was a big fail on my part, but it's okay. We all make mistakes. Life is not perfect. There is a reason one of my podcast guests, Sophie Gray's social media campaign called What I'm Going Through is gaining traction. A lot of it is because so many people are feeling exactly the same way. I do have massive appreciation and respect for people who post life as it really is, and I would love to see more of that. Essentially, it's Instagram stories in the moment, wherever we are, whatever we're doing, however we look in the moment, life as it is. I think the gram might be a lot more enjoyable. One of my friends who did a beautiful post on this subject put it best when she said, "Let's spread love, but let's keep it real." And I agree. So, I digress. Back to the business. In the middle of all this chaos that was forming around me in my new business, I need to mention this because it's an important part of my journey. I found my people. You need a team, whatever that looks like to you, to hold you up. And wow, wow, did they hold me up and pull me through the difficult times. First of all, my husband, Stephen Pataski, I seriously married the best human being that I know, and he has been my biggest supporter every step of this journey. Alongside him is Haley and Carolyn and Jen and Anne, all next level women. And I'm so grateful for every single one of them. I had to lean on them though, and I had to ask for help. I had to admit that I couldn't do it all. It wasn't easy at times, but I had to lean in and lean on them. And together, we worked a lot of crazy hours. We learned together, we got it done, and we figured it out. Mostly. I say mostly because there were still lots of glitches. But I understand now that business, and I want to zero in on this part of the journey because I've had so many people with such great ideas ask me, how'd you do it? How'd you write all those public speaking modules, design the course, map out the journey, create the podcast? How'd you do all of that? Here's the secret. Lean in. It's big. I didn't. I had big, grandiose ideas, but I didn't know how the heck this was all supposed to work. I don't have an MBA or a degree in business. Can you tell it's a bit of a sore spot for me? And if you can't, I'm just going to admit it full out. It is. Oh, and by the way, I Googled it because that's how insecure I was about it. And I actually found only 19% of entrepreneurs, 19% friends, actually have a business degree. So there, it made me feel better. I have a communications degree. I'm a former journalist. I am a storyteller. I'm not really an entrepreneur. Or am I? Because what I had was a burning desire in my soul to make a difference. And every time I thought about what I wanted to do, it felt right. And I know there are so many of you that are listening to me right now that feel exactly the same way. You have great ideas. You have big dreams. Hell, my husband, Stephen, mapped out his idea for our company, the Lexus Group, on a napkin. And he turned it into his life's passion. So what separates me or him or anyone else who is venturing down an entrepreneurial path? We just do it. We take the first step. One decision. That's all it takes to make all the difference. Sometimes it starts with a business plan on a napkin. Sometimes we follow our heart. I took the passion inside my soul, my number one love, the interview, my desire to help people discover their story, and I said, I can do it. I took the first step. Stephen took the first step. And every other entrepreneur I know took that first step. That scary, intimidating, seemingly impossible first step. Impossible until you do it. Impossible until you unleash some of that passion inside of you. And when you do, you start cliff jumping. You see, what I embarked upon wasn't a learning journey, it was a damn cliff. Do you have any idea how many times I've fallen off or cliff jumped in the last year? Countless times. Do you have any idea how many times I wanted to quit? Every single day when times were tough, really tough. Money was tight, growth was slow. I just wanted to quit. Add to that, the stress of it all, it'd wake me up in the middle of the night. I have monkey brain and it never turns off. So I'd wake up and there I'd be at my computer in the middle of the night. What the hell? One side of me wanted to quit. The other side said, nope, you can't. You're stronger than that. You know you're on the right path. So I would muster through the sleepless nights. I'd go to the gym daily and blow off steam. I'd pick myself up, dust myself off, put on countless Band-Aids, and keep on going. You know, when I think about it out loud, like right now, it wasn't failing I was most afraid of. It was giving up. And not giving it an honest try that scared me most. Of walking away and thinking I didn't give it everything I had. I could hear my intuition loud and clear. I'd chosen to follow it. And when you do, you just can't turn back because I knew I was right where I needed to be. Ish. You all know what I'm talking about. Do you know that voice inside of you that keeps trying to get your attention and you keep ignoring it and you know it's right? You know, you're one decision away. One decision away from creating the life you dream of. That's why your intuition is relentless in these cases. If you're really connecting with what I'm saying right now, then you know it's time to listen. It's time to just do it and take that first step. Because you need to remove words like shoulda, coulda, and woulda from your vocabulary and replace them with I did, I failed, I suck, I got up again, and I'm living my dream. Still not easy, but I did it. I listened. I took the first step. I jumped in at 60% and launched this podcast. And the crazy thing is, I did it with my story. Never in the history of my life have I told my story with that level of vulnerability. And a lot of you may not realize that my first podcast, you know, the one with the title, An Introduction to the Inner Circle, is actually my story. I think I gave it that title because in the beginning, I was afraid of failure, afraid of judgment. I mean, I was afraid of it all. But let me tell you this, it felt good. It was so empowering to finally really put myself out there, to finally acknowledge who I am. When I think back on the year that was, my decision to venture where I never thought I would go has changed my life. My vulnerability has helped me grow. It has allowed me to find my true self. Pause on that thought, because here is the backstory. This was a huge and very frightening journey for me. You have to understand that I was a television news anchor for 20 years. The wall that I built up around myself, it stretched into the stratosphere. You only open yourself up so far as a journalist, because when you open yourself up, you also open the door to judgment and criticism, and that is not an easy road to go down. Okay, look, I fully recognize When you're a public figure, a lot of those things come with the territory. That doesn't mean you ever get used to it or that you learn how to navigate it. When I look back on my years as a journalist, they were, without a doubt, some of the best years of my life. That said, you subject yourself to a lot of criticism and to a lot of fear. Like this story, which only my close friends know, but here it goes. I had a horrible stalker for a year. He was calling my mother under one name and calling me under another name. He would show up at events I was at. I needed police surveillance everywhere I went. Things finally came to a head when he showed up at CTV News screaming for me at the reception desk. My boss thought he had a gun. Police arrived, he was taken away, and eventually admitted to a mental hospital. Shortly after that incident, the house we were in the midst of building burned to the ground. It was initially ruled arson, and I lived with that reality for a year until authorities told me their investigation linked it to careless smoking. Whether or not it was tied to that stalker, I will never know. It's just an example that comes to mind when I reflect on the challenges of living in the public eye. So needless to say, I was guarded. I had a huge wall up around me, and I didn't really want to tear that wall down. I never realized my podcast would test my limits as a human being, or for that matter, would be any different than reading the news. I couldn't have been more wrong. When I decided to launch it, I thought it would just be an extension of the interviews I'd been doing as a journalist. Great interviews fuel my soul. Great interviews are all about story. So I hit the record button for 45 minutes, the length of my podcast. It was beyond what I had hoped for. There was one problem though, and I didn't see it at the time, but it became very apparent very quickly. It's a funny little word called vulnerability. It's a funny little word called vulnerability. And every single time I welcomed a guest to the Inner Circle podcast, my guests would breathe life into that word in a way I never could have imagined, nor was I prepared for. People like Glory Meldrum, who was sexually abused by her grandfather, only to go on to create and build, against all odds, the Little Warriors Be Brave Ranch, the only place in Canada that offers space and the opportunity to rebuild broken lives due to sexual abuse. Glory sat across from me at my podcast table and was unapologetically honest and vulnerable. She told me she ripped off her so-called mask years ago. She doesn't want or need to hide from who she is. She loves the person she sees in the mirror. She loves all herself, including the little girl who survived sexual abuse. Finally found the courage to talk about it, only to be questioned and not believed by most of her family. The woman who developed cancer in the exact area that she was victimized. She talked about it all in her podcast. How many of you would walk away at that point and say, no way, I'm not sharing my story, why would I? She did because she understands that by sharing her story, she can impact and change lives. She's now written a book that details her story, all of it. She oozes courage. The courage to be imperfect. The courage to be vulnerable. The courage to embrace her story with her whole heart. When she told her story to me, I heard from people around the world, and so did she. The positive feedback was overwhelming and empowering. And she is just one of 50 people that have so far shared their journey with me on my podcast. Others include Joel Gottlieb, a former television news anchor who had a horrible battle and addiction to opioids. He's now using his story to educate people, change lives, and hopefully change laws. And then there's Shelley Wynn. Her husband was an RCMP officer shot and killed in the line of duty. She was initially told the RCMP didn't fully fund counseling services for families following a heartbreaking loss. Well, she fought back and she won. And now any family within the RCMP that loses a member in the line of duty will have access to those benefits, all because Shelley used her voice and said, "We deserve better," all because she shared her story. Rachel Milkey also struck a chord with so many people because she's well known right across North America, but she was so vulnerable when she told the story of her entrepreneurial journey. She fully admitted she almost bankrupted her company after she received an investment from well-known entrepreneur and philanthropist Brett Wilson. She finally got a break when the Queen, yes, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, wore one of the brooches that was designed by Rachel. And since that time, Rachel and her amazing company, Hilberg and Burke, have been commissioned several times to make the Queen more jewelry. Talk about rising from near ashes. And then there's a story like Jen Cole's. Her husband was a cheater and then tried to break her in every possible way during their divorce settlement. So much so, he even tried to take away a charitable foundation that she had established to help underprivileged women. Jen said, "Not on my watch," fought back, took her divorce settlement, and started a lingerie company. She fully admits she knew nothing about a lingerie company when she launched. She just wanted to do something important for herself and her children. So she took the first step. Her company is called Avery Rose, now into its 4th year, and she was just featured at New York Fashion Week. I don't think I can put into words how many people across the world have reached out to me and said, "Thank you for sharing these stories. They are incredible." I've heard from countless people how a particular podcast had an enormous impact on their life, changed the way they think, what they believe, empowered them to take control of their own lives, perhaps in a new and different way. And do you know what's beautiful and powerful about all of this? The more people who hear these stories, the greater the impact. So many people thank me. But please understand that all I do is open a door. I facilitate a conversation. I build trust, and then I see where they go. I wish that all of you listening could feel what unfolds at my podcast table. It's extraordinary. Or maybe you do when you're listening. I hope you do, because when I record a podcast, it's almost like a spiritual experience. What I see and what I feel is hard to put into words because my guests go there. There's been a lot of tears shed at my podcast table. There have been countless hugs and more stories shared than I can count. And through the stories come powerful connections, courage, and vulnerability. And there's that word again. The word that has been the absolute game changer in my life. Vulnerability. So remember earlier when I mentioned that I was getting ready to launch my podcast and I was recording guests, but I wasn't quite prepared for what was to come? Well, here's what happened. My guests were going there, and I mean really going there. The courage they were demonstrating, sharing their stories, and the vulnerability that shone through each one was remarkable. My big launch date was coming, and I knew, or maybe I should say I thought, I needed a big name to kick off my podcast. Maybe someone famous, a person whose name was recognizable. But who would that person be? I made a list and quickly discovered that when you call someone up and you can no longer say, "Hey, I'm Carrie Doll from CTV," people respond a little different. When I called someone up in, let's say, Los Angeles, They didn't know who the heck I was, and usually ended up asking, like, who are you? And like, what do you want? And what are you doing? As I searched and I searched and I made asks and invitations, I came up dry. I was sitting at my computer one night, boiling over with frustration, when my husband Stephen said casually to me, "You do know who your first interview should be, don't you?" And I said, "Well, if you know, you better spill the beans really fast because I am running out of time." He said, "I've known for a long time who it should be. I just don't know if you are ready to hear it." He said, "It's you." "Me?" I said. "What are you talking about?" He said, "It's time you tell your story. All of your story." I was dumbfounded. And at the same time, I knew he was absolutely right. I mean, how could I possibly ask people to share their lives and their stories with me and I not do the same? I'd be a fraud. I needed to do this. But how? Because I knew what he meant when he said, all of my story. It means the tough stuff that people never got to see or hear from when I was a journalist, like how broken I was when my mom died. And even saying those words, "I am broken," seemed impossible to me. Because in my head, I felt like I was being weak. So I circle back to my earlier comment about there being a problem. The problem was me. If I was asking people to share, I needed to reciprocate. I needed to go down the vulnerability road in a way that I didn't understand at the time. Here's the funny thing. Once I sat down in front of my computer and started to write my story, it all came pouring out of me. I couldn't write fast enough. I guess it was a sign I needed to do it, and I needed to do it in the most authentic way. And after it was done, it was cathartic, but it scared the shit out of me because all I could think was, what are people going to think of me? Are they going to judge me and think less of me because I admitted all of my weaknesses? You know, the stress was paralyzing. I almost pulled the plug on that podcast so many times until I read it to Stephen. And he said, "I don't know if I've ever been more proud of you." And here's the punchline in this whole experience. What Stephen said is what everybody said when I recorded it and released it to the world. When I gave people the true Carrie doll and honored my authentic self, that's when I really connected with people. I had one friend say to me, "I'm tired of the girl I got to see on TV. I want the real deal. I want that girl I get to work out beside, the funny one and the silly one that loves to joke around, the one I have those real, raw conversations with." And the crazy thing is I never realized that I was that guarded until I let my guard down. And wow, was it ever liberating. And here's the thing with vulnerability. I hated it at the beginning because I didn't get it. As I mentioned before, I thought it just made me look weak. I mean, why would I ever want to admit my weaknesses in front of other people? But suddenly, when I truly allowed myself to be seen, I started to get messages from people everywhere. They would say, "Me too, me too." And then they would follow by saying things like, "When you talked about how broken you felt, it made me feel normal. It gave me permission to feel because I went through the same thing. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for your vulnerability." Like, what? This feedback blew my mind. Thank you? Really? Yes, really. And it was during this time that I discovered the great Brené Brown, a professor and vulnerability researcher. If you don't know who she is and you're not familiar with her work, just watch her vulnerability talk on Netflix, and I promise you it will be worth every second of your time. And Brené, by the way, if you or your people are listening right now, can you just give me a podcast? I'd really love that. All my listeners would really love that. So can you just think about it for a moment and consider it? I digress. Okay, so anyway, Brené says, quote, when you do something that makes you feel shaky and scared, and you just want to turn around and escape the potential of judgment from others and your own fear of the unfamiliar, this is vulnerability. But by pushing through those doors, you are doing something far more healthy and transformative. Vulnerability is the core, the heart, the center of all meaningful human experiences. Add to that, when we think of times that we have felt vulnerable or emotionally exposed, we are actually recalling times of great courage. Somebody please ring the gong, cue the marching band, pop the champagne. This is what I call the most massive learning experience of my life. I mean, here I had thought I had taken the biggest risk of my life that had the potential to backfire, and I was confused as to why I felt so darn empowered doing so. And suddenly, it was all making sense. By sharing my story, by exposing myself and honoring who I really was, I was pushing through those doors. I was doing something healthy and transformative for me. I was being courageous, and damn, that felt good. So I released the podcast, and messages, they flooded in from everywhere. There were so many that I was overwhelmed, and all were so supportive. I want to share one of the reviews from iTunes that someone wrote, and they said, quote, "Oh my God, did not expect what I just heard. Powerful opening show with Carrie acting solo, opening up about her story. Plenty of vulnerability, passion, tears, and laughs. Definitely makes me feel more normal about my challenges, but also uplifted and leaving with a belief that I can do so much more." This was followed by two incredible entrepreneurs who told their stories, and wow, they were amazing. Cannot wait to hear more, and Carrie certainly has a gift of the interview. Thrilled to be in the inner circle. Boom, there it was. All the validation I needed that vulnerability was now the third drug I would start to rely heavily on in my life, along with exercise and the sun. I could not, nor would I ever want to turn back on this vulnerability path now that I started on it, because it has forever changed who I am and what I do. But it wasn't just me. I was noticing it happening all around me. I was just late to this vulnerability game. My podcast guests were going there, and the learnings and the takeaways and the connections from each conversation were rich, rich, rich. And during this past year, vulnerability and I have become friends, really good friends. I mean, sometimes it's a love-hate relationship, but I'm working on it. I'm no longer afraid to open up to my podcast guests and share experiences that may relate to their challenges and their fears. It's now easy for me to say, me too, when tough subjects come up. I also talk about my struggles in business and in life when I'm giving keynote speeches, because I know that is the key to enabling the audience to connect with me and to share their stories. We learn from each other's journeys, but part of this vulnerability pathway is the willingness to do or say something when there are no guarantees that you will hear those words in return. So be prepared for that. This is a new journey for me. And now I want to open the door for you to embrace the same. If you are struggling putting yourself out there, having your voice heard, uncovering and embracing your story, and I know that many of you are because I've heard from you, if It's okay. What's not okay, though, is not to do something about it. Because when you don't use your voice, you give your power away. You are letting someone speak for you. And why would you ever give your power away? How would you react if your kids told you you were going to let, or they were going to let someone else speak for them because they were too scared to use their voice? If this makes you angry, good. It should. Let it serve as a motivator for you to lead by example and embrace the power of your voice so your kids will do it too. When I'm coaching clients about storytelling and public speaking, the number one thing I hear, especially from women, and it does hurt my heart to admit this, they tell me that they don't feel worthy to use their voice, worthy to tell their story, worthy to stand up in a room and be heard. It's time to change that. If I can embrace vulnerability, you can start to embrace the power of your story. And when you do that, just be ready for the tidal wave of connection that's going to come your way. I've talked a lot, but before I wrap, I want to leave you with some concrete takeaways that I was fortunate enough to learn firsthand. So first and most important, take the first step. One decision is all it takes to change the path of your life. You will know when it's time to make a change because that voice inside of you will keep popping up. It's relentless. It wants you to listen. So listen. Take the first step. I promise you, the first step is the scariest. It's also the game changer. Second, 60% is all you need when you are launching something new. The key within that 60%, though, has to be passion. When you feed your passion, it's like pouring gasoline on your dreams. The more I did it, the more I wanted to. Find your passion. Pour gasoline on it. And while you're at it, be a cliff jumper. You are going to fall off that learning cliff so many times you will be black and blue. Question is, how do you heal? How bad do you want it? What are you willing to do to follow your dream? Third, tell your story. You've heard me say it a million times in my podcast. Every voice needs and deserves to be heard. Are you using your voice? Are you embracing your story? If you don't tell your story, who will? Now is the time. Fourth, embrace vulnerability because vulnerability equals courage. Putting walls up and not talking about your feelings is how I used to be wired. It was my normal. Not anymore. When we are vulnerable, we allow ourselves to really be seen. And when we do that, we connect with people. I feel like I have really stepped into my own skin now that I am honoring who I really am. My final advice relates to my why. At the start of this podcast, I mentioned that over this last year, through the ups and downs, I found my why. And here it is. I was put on this earth to help people discover their voice and to use it to tell their stories. My why is directly connected to my storytelling and public speaking coaching business and to this podcast. I'm right where I need to be. Now I challenge you to uncover your why. Your why is directly related to your story. Work to uncover it. And when you do, share it with the world. It needs and deserves to be heard. You are worthy to share it. Please embrace it. When you allow yourself to be seen, the world will open up to you. To each and every one of you, I extend a massive virtual hug. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing your time with me today. But most importantly, thank you for holding space for every single guest that I've had the honor of interviewing. Every single one has been a gift. I will close with this. After a year, I have decided to charge a fee for my podcast. But the fee isn't what you think it is. You're not going to have to pay money. All I ask is that you share this podcast with one person. So for every episode you have listened to, tell one person, but only refer that person if you felt something while listening to this podcast. If it made you laugh or made you cry or moved you or impacted your life in some way. It's the impact that matters. So if you feel moved, tell a friend. And then go to whatever platform that you listen on and give us a like, give us a share, write a review. Sharing my podcast is the greatest gift that you can give me. Thanks for listening, everybody. Your love and support means everything to me.